Good afternoon, everyone. This is welcome to the Regional Plan Snapshot for February 7th, 2022. I'm Sarah Dector. I'm the Comprehensive and Neighborhood Planning Manager for the City of Flagstaff. And with me today, Ed Schenk, our Stormwater Manager at the city, and Christopher Tressler from the County Engineering. We are on Snapshot 15 of 24, which is exciting, as we move through a lot of different material that forms the basis for regional planning in our community. These regional snapshots happen most Mondays at noon. We skip some holidays. The registration and schedule is always published to our regional plan website, flagstaff.az.gov/regional plan 2045. Today's presentation will be 15-minute of Q&A after our 15-minute presentation. So I'd like to ask you to hold your questions, or you may type them in the chat during the presentation, but we won't be letting anyone unmute to ask questions until this very short presentation is concluded. After the meeting, we post the presentation to the City of Flagstaff YouTube channel. We always remind everyone that everything this early in the regional plan process is a draft. We are sharing what information is available right now to staff so that we can have a transparent and open conversation with the public, but there's certainly more to learn, and we are hoping that it is a process in which we all learn together. I'll remind you too that next Monday, February 14th, we have our second in the ecosystem series, and that presentation will be made by Hannah Grissom and Jessica from the county, both of whom are wildlife biologists. So that should be a really interesting one if you want to tune back in next week. And so this presentation today is the second in our series on emergency management, which is a big, broad topic, and we have really appreciated all the wonderful expertise of the staff, both at the city, the county, and the emergency management office as well. And so with that, I'm going to hand over the presentation to Mr. Tressler.
Thank you, Sarah. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you good.
Okay, great. So we can go to the next slide. So I think some terminology is the purpose of this slide is to talk about some terminology and what it means so that we're really talking the same language. When we talk about flood mitigation, it's to minimize the effects of disaster. And most recently, we've been talking a lot about mitigation, flood mitigation in the county and the city of Flagstaff as it relates to the museum fire and the what we call museum flooding. Where we're not trying to control, we can't prevent all flood events, but we try to mitigate as much as we can. We try to prevent human disasters. We try to prepare for things. We work with our partners, with our first responders, to be able to respond to natural disasters or other man-caused disasters, and then we work in kind of a recovery aspect of how can we get back to a new normal or a new sense of normal. So we can go to the next slide. So we're talking about watersheds and drainage systems, and this slide indicates there's 20 well-defined watersheds or significant watersheds in the Flagstaff region, but it just depends on how a watershed is defined. And there's actually, probably several hundred, if not thousands, of watersheds, micro watersheds that can be defined, and it just depends on the contributing point of whatever the upstream watershed area is. Within the city, in the county, in this region, most, if not all, of the streams are ephemeral. There's some intermittent streams, and most of the streams that have perennial surface water are supplied. The water is supplied by springs, and our snowpack doesn't stick around to contribute and create a base flow for any significant amount of time. So we can go to the next slide. So as floodplain managers, or as people like the county or the city of Flagstaff who's chosen to manage their floodplains, as we look at managing our floodplains, managing what are termed waters of the U.S., we look at these two terms quite often, what our 100-year floodplain is and what our floodway is. And these two terms and the definition and the delineation of these is tied to FEMA and our federal government and how they've termed these and how they'll be managed. And really the county and the city and any other floodplain administrator is just administering the floodplain as per FEMA standards. Let's go to the next slide. So a little bit of background on the county flood control district is that since 1974, the county's been participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. And the district was formed in 1984 as to fund projects and to fund staff to carry out the National Flood Insurance Program and to monitor and help guide development in floodplains in a responsible way. It's of note that the city of Flagstaff, Page, and Fredonia have chosen to manage their own floodplains. And so they opt out of flood control district administration of it, and they assume administration of their own floodplains. And they follow the same rules and the same guidelines that the county would under the county flood control district. It's just they're collecting their own tax if they want to, and they're managing their floodplains in a similar way. We can go to the next slide. So the flood control district and its mission, and you can look on the county website for more information if you just Google Coconino County Flood Control District. But we're charged with reducing the risk of flood loss, minimizing the impacts of floods on human safety, health, and welfare, and restoring and preserving the natural and beneficial values served by floodplains. The Coconino County Community Development Department houses staff that receive permits from developers and from people wanting to conduct activities within floodplains, and they're evaluated and permits are issued or denied based on FEMA guidelines and standards. And so now I'm going to turn the next few slides over to Ed Schenk, and he's going to talk about the city and their administration of the floodplain. Ed?
Thank you, Christopher. So the city of Flagstaff operates fairly similar to the county. We are the local FEMA floodplain administrator, as the county is for the rest, or most of the rest of the county. Within the stormwater section, we operate, like I've mentioned, fairly similar in terms of flood control and FEMA floodplains. We do also serve as the point of contact for development review and development permits related to drainage and floodplains. And we also are responsible for our own maintenance. So within the stormwater section, we have a maintenance program for both the open channels within Flagstaff that are either city owned or have a public drainage easement, and then also for all closed infrastructure. So infrastructure that's underground, that's within city right of way or city easement. So fairly similar to flood control districts, some small administrative differences, mostly to the difference between the city functions and the county functions. But otherwise, in terms of regulations and overall goals and objectives, we're very similar. Next slide. So in terms of floodplain regulations, there's quite a bit there. And for this short talk, we're not going to go deep into it. You can actually take a look at the flood hazard layers, so the floodplains for your area. If you go to that link on the left, or also msc.fema.gov will take you to a map viewer where you can drill down to it. Both Coconino County and City of Flagstaff also maintains the floodplain layers with their own links. You can easily, well, the county one's over here. Well, or this is our GIS. If you Google it, either the county or the city, depending on where you live, you can pull up those floodplain maps and some more information. In terms of regulations, as Christopher mentioned, both the city and the county have similar regulations since we operate under federal and state guidelines. There's some minor local regulations that are added on top of that, but they're fairly small. And again, for the purpose of this talk, we really won't delve into it. We could spend hours talking about the different permutations of the regulations depending on what we are discussing. Next slide. So what is the purpose of the regulations? A lot of that is to reduce the flood threat and to preventatively mitigate for any potential flooding. There's also a lot of things we can do on a more routine basis, and kind of showing some examples of that in this slide. So flood proofing, for example, we have two different types of flood proofing, wet flood proofing and dry flood proofing. That picture you see on the upper left is an example of dry flood proofing. What is the difference? With dry just means we're trying to keep things literally dry. So here you see a flood door to prevent water from entering a residence or a commercial building. A wet flood proofing is where we intentionally allow it to get wet, but we do it in a way where we're reducing the chance of mold, mildew, or damage. So a lot of times those would be flood vents or water vents in subgrade structures. So for example, basements or crawlways, so that we allow the water to flow through and out and dry the area below. So again, we have both wet and dry flood proofing. Road and access management, both the county and the city work under the same multi-jurisdictional, multi-hazard plan that's put out by the county every 5 years. Part of that is, how do we manage for our infrastructure? So getting in and out of areas and making sure we can do that. Channel maintenance. Obviously, we wanted to have well-maintained channels, clear channels to allow for drainage. So both organizations, the county and the city, have active maintenance programs for keeping those channels clear of debris, clear of vegetation, and in a way that they can flow naturally. Elevation, if you see that picture on the bottom, it's kind of hard to see, but that house on the left is actually raised compared to the house on the right. So both through the development review process, we make sure that we actually have the correct elevation for any new houses or any new developments, so that we are above what's called the base flood elevation. The base flood elevation is determined for these FEMA floodplains as they're mapped and remapped. So we will make sure that we have our 1 foot rise above the BFE, the base flood elevation, to mitigate or prevent regular floodings. May not mitigate for those really large floods. It's almost impossible to prevent flooding, but to reduce the threat of flooding and reduce the damage and safety issues. Facilities maintenance, very similar to channel maintenance, just working on our catch basins, our pipes, our culverts, etc., to make sure that they are free and clear. And then, as we're talking about development review, there's a picture of one of our in development subdivisions. So we try to mitigate as best as possible before things go in, so that we don't have to come in after the fact where it's much more costly, both to the government and also to the private interests to mitigate for flooding. All right, next slide. So picture here is part of the Rio de Flag watershed. We do have different plans both at the city and county level. One plan that's in development right now is a watershed plan for the Rio de Flag under what's called the Watershed Alliance for the Rio de Flag, the WARF. And this was funded through a Water Smart grant from the Bureau of Reclamation to a local nonprofit, Friends of the Rio. And Friends of the Rio is working with a number of stakeholders, including the city, the county, Forest Service, tribes, NEU, to work on a more holistic kind of umbrella watershed plan for flood mitigation, but not just that, also for watershed improvements, ecology, and bringing in recreational activities. So this plan has had public input in public stakeholder meetings since 2018, and it's wrapping up. This is the last year. 2022 is the last year for developing that plan before it goes to the city council and the county board of supervisors. for their review and hopefully for their input and agreement to make this plan ours, essentially at the county and city level. All right, next slide. And the purpose of these large plans is to incorporate some of the large projects that we have going on within the watershed and within the county as well. One of the biggest ones, as many of you are aware, is the Rio de Flag Flood Control Project. So this is a project between the City of Flagstaff and the Army Corps of Engineers. It's been ongoing for over 20 years. Unfortunately, it's kind of been slow going, but we're getting there. And the purpose of the project is to reduce the flood potential in downtown Flagstaff and the South Side community. There's been some phases of the project that have been completed. For example, if you take a look at that map on the west side, the Clay Avenue Wash Detention Basin is complete behind the city public works facility. The Butler Tunnel on the east side of the project, on the right side of this figure, is also complete. So that's a large tunnel that's sized for the future alignment of the Rio de Flag. It goes under Butler near Warner's landscaping. And then the Thorpe Bridge just upstream of Thorpe Park and the Francis Short Pond, that has also been completed. We still have two very large phases. What's shown on here is phase 1 and phase 2 that we've been planning on for quite a while with the Army Corps and partners. So it's a very complicated property rights, property acquisition, etc. But we do have the full designs for those, and we're moving forward with them. Next slide. With that, I'll move it back to the county.
Well, there's another project, flood control district, and forest restoration group is looking at. It's the upper Rio de Flag watershed. And we know that if we don't continue to treat and manage our forests differently, that the threat to catastrophic wildfire remains, as well as the potential for flooding after a wildfire. And so there's an effort to evaluate the upper Rio de Flag, and we're seeking funding and conducting analysis to support that effort. And the next slide. Well, some of the other things that the flood control district has done along with the City of Flagstaff Stormwater Management Group is the response to the museum fire and the museum fire flooding events. And over 400 homes have been mitigated and 35 businesses. We've deployed a significant amount of sandbags and concrete barriers, trying to decrease the impacts of that flooding as a result of the museum fire. That fire happened 2 years ago, and we had such a dry season, dry monsoon season the next 2 years that we didn't see any flooding. But we estimated that the threat of flooding was still very real. And so we've held more than 15 community meetings, a significant amount right before each monsoon season, to inform the public of what we understand the flood risks to be. And then the city and the flood control district have established a flood monitoring system that helps us to hopefully put out early warning to residents who might be in the flood hazard area so that they can seek shelter. We want people to shelter in place. If they're outside, to seek higher ground. But that's something that the flood control district would typically do in situations like this when requested by other jurisdictions. And then on the next slide, it's an example of more longer term projects, flood mitigation projects that were conducted in the Schultz area after the Schultz fire, and mitigating the flooding that happened in those areas. The flood control district carried out these projects over several years. The Schultz fire happened in 2010, and I think the last project was finishing up in like 2015 or 2016. And the projects actually in 2018, there was a significant rainfall event above the Brandis watershed. And in other areas in that burned area also saw a significant amount of rainfall. And we saw a lot of success in those flood mitigation projects in managing the stormwater and getting it to pass with minimal damage to homes and other infrastructure. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Thank you, Chris. As with all of our snapshots, it's not just that there are definitive answers on many of these topics. We have a lot as we are beginning this regional plan process that we will continue to be curious about and keep working on understanding along with the community. Some of the questions we want the public and our staff to be thinking about as we work on regional planning for land uses. As Ed showed, we want to be ahead of the curve and thinking about hazards before things are built and constructed in the community. Some of the things that are fundamental, we could have done hours and hours of presentations on these, and there are videos and other things you can find. So is how does the role of the federal and the local jurisdictions differ, and how do we work together? How can our community be prepared and resilient to changes in flooding that may result from climate change? How can we work effectively across multiple landowners? You've seen from the last 2 snapshots and from this one that our land ownership is not contiguously Forest Service and then contiguously private. It's an intermix. And so mixing of land ownership means that projects have to be collaborative to be successful. We also are thinking forward in our land use discussions about balancing how rural and urban development needs with our natural occurrence of flooding and resources that may be dependent on the riparian habitats that the drainages and those intermittent and ephemeral streams in our community provide for birds and wildlife and frogs and many other creatures that are part of our landscape. And so with that, I'll stop sharing and we went a little long today, so we'll have about 10 minutes for question and answer. And then we will conclude today's webinar. I think there was one question in the chat. And Ed, I already see there's a little thanks everybody for managing the chat well. Nat has a question that maybe you'll want to ask out loud, and then Ed said he'd be happy to respond. So Nat and then Ed.
Yeah, I think, well, does Nat want to ask the question out loud, or do you just want us to respond to what's been placed in the chat?
There was a series of questions, but basically any floodplain regulations has an effect on costs, whether it's taxpayers or business owners or private people. And so I was just wondering about how accurate the estimates are that FEMA makes for the Flagstaff locality or any other locality as far as 100-year floodplains and all the threats and things. And it's in a changing dynamic because of the changing climate too. So that's the gist of the question.
Yeah, sure. And it's a really good question that our science is better today than it was, historically, and we have really good models that can help us and help FEMA understand what the extent, the width, depth of some of these flood events that we're looking at as we map our floodplains. And so, yeah, with, for example, the county has undertaken several studies, Kachina Village, Mountain Air, Mountain Dell, Fort Valley, to in a sense remap those areas to more accurately understand what the width of the floodplain is and what those floodplains, the actual character is. And I know the city does as well. And most developers, if they're developing a significant piece of land, they can go in and remodel and develop a study. And then it's a person, if they want to change the map, it goes through what's called a CLOMAR and LOMAR process, where they actually create the new model and potentially a better model. And then it's proposed to FEMA under what's called a CLOMAR, conditional letter of map revision. And FEMA can conditionally approve a project. The project can be carried out, and then the developer or the city or whoever submits the official letter of map revision, or submits for a letter of map revision, and so it gets updated. And so, we don't want to overburden our residents and the developing community any more than we have to, but we do want to promote responsible development in our floodplains and around our wetlands and our meadows and things like that. And so we take off, we model as much as we can and manage as much as we can. And but it's also somewhat the responsibility of developers to identify that as well. It's kind of like we're all responsible to pay the least amount of taxes as we can, and we're supposed to calculate our taxes, and we shouldn't overburden ourselves any more than we have to. That's a really good question. Thanks. Is there another question in the chat, Sarah?
Not right now. Ed, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, Christopher did a great job kind of summarizing it. The only thing I would add is I think Nat had a question of, looking 50 years out or et cetera. And that's a little difficult to do since we have most of this in an urban environment, or at least suburban. So as things change, as you have different roads go in, culverts change out, channels change, et cetera, it's really hard to model these things out for 50 years. So we do, as Christopher mentioned, we'll do those LOMARs as needed, and then just continue to revise those floodplain maps as needed. So it's kind of more demand driven than driven by a set schedule.
I think that it's definitely worth noting that this, the plan itself, the regional plan, is going to look at 20, 50, 80, 100-year land use patterns. And that underneath that big view of like where we build out, how our community grows, who we're going to be in 100 years as a community, are a lot of these adaptive management cycles, like the one Ed and Chris are providing, where we can't just assess it at this regional plan level. We have to keep assessing on a regular occurrence, and for shorter intervals and longer intervals, and understanding and tracking the changing conditions. And so that is something that the flood control district and the stormwater section, the city, when it comes to flooding, are doing on a regular basis. And it's part of what the taxes that are collected for the district and the fee that's collected for stormwater in the city are funding, is that understanding, so that we do stay adaptive and ready for changes that are coming, changes that can be predicted, and then also responding to changes that, or outcomes that weren't part of predictions. We're making lots of assumptions and doing our best, and the data gets better all the time. The science gets better all the time. We're lucky here that USGS is in our community, and they give a lot of observations and share data with the city and the county that is very helpful in all of these efforts. So Ed and Chris, would you want to add anything about partnerships with FEMA or USGS that might be useful for folks to know about? And then we'll, if there's no more questions, we'll conclude.
Yeah, I like bringing up that John Wesley Powell, back shortly after the Civil War and as civilization spread out west, really promoted that political boundaries should be watershed boundaries, and that people would manage their watershed and their water resources, based on the areas that they're living in. And that didn't quite take hold everywhere. And so it just makes it all that more important that we work with our partners on state and federal lands and our neighboring communities, and that we look at water resources and impacts to our watersheds, and that it's a very collaborative process, and there's a lot of stakeholders involved.
Any final words, Ed?
I think Christopher hit it on the head there, but no, we continue to work, both the county and city work with a number of partners, not just among ourselves, but also at the federal level. And, sometimes it works really well, sometimes it doesn't, just like all partnerships. But we do work with FEMA, we do work with other agencies as needed for each of the projects. And if you have any particular questions, we're happy to answer those now or later. Thank you.
Great. Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today.